A breakthrough for scientists after they had a 20-minute conversation with a humpback whale.
Did it say I'm tired of fish? I'm tired of plankton?
I have.
So this team, including a professor from UC Davis, is hoping for more interspecies dialogue following this groundbreaking exchange with a whale named Twain.
A whale answered a question it was never asked to understand, and the scientists who heard it are still not sure what that means. Off the coast of Alaska, in water calm enough to strip away the usual noise that ruins these experiments, a research team lowered a speaker into the sea and played back a single sound, a humpback contact call, the closest thing this species has to a greeting. What came back was not a grunt of curiosity or a passing flick of a tail. What came back was a conversation, and by the time it ended, a decades-old assumption about who gets to use language on this planet had started to come apart. For most of the 20th century, whale sound was treated as background. Interesting, occasionally haunting, but ultimately noise, the acoustic equivalent of static, catalogued and archived and left alone. Sperm whale clicks in particular were filed this way for roughly 60 years. Researchers recorded them, described their rhythm, noted when they occurred, and moved on, because the working theory held that these were simple signals. An announcement, a location ping, nothing structured enough to reward closer study. That theory did not die from a single discovery. It died the way old scientific consensus usually does, slowly, and then all at once, when new tools were finally pointed at old data. The humpback encounter is where this story becomes vivid, so it is worth sitting with it. The team behind the experiment included researchers from the CETI Institute, the University of California, Davis, and the Alaska Whale Foundation, led by Dr. Brenda McCowan. Their target sound had been recorded the day before, taken from a small group of humpbacks that included a well-documented 38-year-old female known to researchers as Twain, catalogued, photographed, tracked across multiple seasons. The team's expectation was modest. Best case, a brief investigative response, a whale approaching out of curiosity, vocalizing once or twice, then losing interest. What they got instead was 36 exchanges across 20 minutes. Twain approached the boat, circled it, and began answering the calls directly, not with random noise but with a structured back and forth. When the researchers changed the timing between playbacks, lengthening or shortening the gap, her responses shifted to match. She was not simply making noise near a boat. She was taking turns. Turn-taking sounds like a small thing until you consider what it requires. It means recognizing a pause as a slot reserved for a response, not a gap to be filled or ignored. It is one of the load-bearing features of human conversation, and it does not happen by accident 36 times in a row while the tempo keeps changing underneath it. McCowan and her colleagues have described the exchange as among the first documented cases of a structured communicative exchange between humans and a humpback whale, conducted using the whale's own signaling system. It was remarkable on its own. But it was not, as it turns out, the strangest development in this field. That distinction belongs to a different ocean, a different species, and a conversation that began, almost by accident, in a hallway at Harvard. Marine biologist David Gruber was reviewing old sperm whale recordings from the Caribbean, clicks he had logged years earlier for an unrelated project, when a colleague passed his open door and stopped. That colleague was Shafi Goldwasser, a cryptographer at MIT and a Turing Award laureate, someone who has spent her career studying how information gets deliberately concealed inside patterns. She listened for a moment and asked Gruber whether anyone had ever run the clicks through machine learning, because to her ear, they sounded like they might be encoded, closer to Morse code than to noise. It was not a poetic remark. It was a technical observation from someone whose entire discipline is built around recognizing when a pattern is carrying information rather than simply repeating itself. And the honest answer, after decades of cetacean research across every ocean on Earth, was that nobody had tried. That question became the foundation of Project CETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, formally launched in 2020 and drawing researchers from MIT, Harvard, UC Berkeley, and more than a dozen partner institutions spanning biology, robotics, linguistics, cryptography, and machine learning. AI researcher Michael Bronstein joined the effort with a specific argument. The same deep learning architectures used to model human language could, in principle, be pointed at any large enough dataset of structured signals, whale clicks included. If the underlying structure existed, the model would find it. The obstacle was never the theory. It was the data. Nobody had ever collected enough recordings, with enough context, to give a model something real to work with. Project CETI chose the waters off Dominica for a reason. It is one of the only places on Earth where multi-generational sperm whale families return reliably, season after season, known matriarchs, tracked social units, something close to a neighborhood rather than a passing population. The team deployed permanently moored hydrophone arrays, suction cup biologging tags carrying synchronized microphones, depth sensors, and motion trackers, all built to answer one question for every single click. Who made it, who else was nearby, and what was happening in that exact moment? Roughly 9,000 recordings eventually went into the analysis, and what came back reshaped the field's basic vocabulary. Before this project, researchers believed sperm whales used about 21 distinct click patterns, called codas, each carrying one fixed meaning, a closed set, functioning something like a traffic signal. The new analysis identified 156. But the number itself is not the finding that matters. What matters is what researchers found inside each coda. Features that vary independently of one another, including tempo, the overall speed of a click sequence, rhythm, the spacing between individual clicks, ornamentation, extra clicks added at the edges of a pattern, and rubato, small elastic stretches in timing layered across a sequence. These are not fixed signals. They are combinable parts, capable of producing a far larger space of possible messages than a simple closed set ever could. This is where the comparison to human language becomes difficult to dismiss. Linguists describe human speech as built from a small number of individually meaningless sounds that recombine into a functionally unlimited number of meaningful units, a property called duality of patterning, long treated as one of the clearest lines separating human language from animal signaling. Finding that same structural principle at work half a mile beneath the surface, in an animal clicking in total darkness, does not prove the presence of language in the way we understand it. But it does remove one of the assumptions that made the old dismissal easy. Then came a finding that had nothing to do with vocabulary at all. Researchers observed the same individual whale producing measurably different patterns depending on who it was addressing. Linguists call this audience design, the same underlying reason a person speaks differently to a child than to a colleague. It is not simply a stylistic flourish. It requires holding a working model of another individual's perspective, understanding that the listener knows different things than you do, and adjusting output accordingly. In human development, that capacity, known as theory of mind, does not typically appear until around age 4. Whether whales possess a genuine version of it remains an open and contested question, but the mere presence of audience design-like variation was enough to make experienced researchers pause. Around the same time, linguist Gašper Beguš at UC Berkeley took older Dominica recordings and slowed them down to examine the internal acoustic shape of individual clicks, the way a phonetician studies a spoken syllable. What he found were structures with the resonant geometry of vowels, not loose analogies, but patterns showing the same frequency relationships that define vowel sounds across human languages, including what appeared to be diphthong-like glides, one vowel sliding into another. Beguš has been careful in how he frames this, noting that whale communication was long treated as something closer to Morse code, and that this new analysis suggests a level of complexity researchers did not expect to find. The disorienting part is not the sound itself. It is the anatomy required to produce it. Human vowels depend on a lowered larynx, precise tongue and jaw control, and a reshapable resonating chamber, machinery that evolved over millions of years under pressure specifically tied to speech. Sperm whales have none of that anatomy. Their sound-producing organs evolved for an entirely different purpose: echolocation, sending sound into total darkness and reading what bounces back. That the same structures, evolved for sonar, would independently produce something that mimics the acoustic fingerprint of vowels is a case of convergent evolution. The same phenomenon that gave sharks and dolphins similar body shapes despite branching apart hundreds of millions of years ago. This is the point where conversational AI systems like Grok enter the story, and it is worth being precise about their actual role, because it is smaller and more honest than headlines often suggest. Grok did not analyze hydrophone recordings. It cannot listen to a click train and verify meaning, and it cannot settle disputes between competing interpretations of the same acoustic data. What a large language model can do is take dense, technical findings, originally published in the language of acoustics and computational linguistics, and translate them into terms a general audience can actually follow, while flagging clearly which comparisons are well supported and which remain speculative. When researchers describe rubato or duality of patterning or audience design, a system like Grok can lay out what those terms mean, map them against known concepts in human phonology and linguistics, and be transparent about where the evidence is genuinely thin. That is not discovery. It is translation, in the most literal sense, collapsing the distance between a specialist's paper and a person scrolling through a video, and in doing so, exposing findings to a level of public scrutiny and public unease that a locked academic journal never would have generated. The historical record adds weight that acoustic analysis alone cannot provide. 19th-century whaling logs, studied by researchers including Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell, show something striking. After American whalers moved into new Pacific hunting grounds, their strike rates were initially high, then collapsed by roughly 58% within about 2.5 years. The whales had not left the area. They had changed their behavior, moving upwind where sailing vessels struggled to follow, abandoning defensive tactics that worked against natural predators but proved fatal against harpoons. Many of the animals adopting these new behaviors had never personally encountered a whaling ship, which means the information moved through the population faster than direct experience could explain, spreading through social networks across family groups and ocean basins. Historian Bathsheba DeMuth, working through period whaling records, has noted that the men aboard those ships often wrote about the animals seeming to communicate with one another, and about younger whales appearing to know things they could not have learned firsthand. These were not scientists building a theory. They were sailors recording something they could not explain, in the only language available to them at the time. The most famous single incident from that era remains the sinking of the whale ship Essex in 1820, an event later immortalized in Moby Dick. First mate Owen Chase documented an enormous bull sperm whale that approached the ship, appeared to hesitate, then struck the hull with enough force to destroy it, circled back, and struck the same damaged section a second time. Chase's own account wavers between describing the animal as acting out of apparent fury and describing what looked, unmistakably, like calculation. Some researchers have since raised a specific and unproven hypothesis that repeated hammering by the crew, repairing another boat in the hours before the attack, may have transmitted rhythmic strikes into the water that resembled click patterns, registering to the whale not as a threat but as a signal. This remains speculation, impossible to verify 2 centuries later. But it sits alongside a documented pattern of similar incidents, including the sinking of the And Alexander in 1851 and the Kathleen in 1902, both attributed to deliberate strikes by sperm whales rather than panicked flight. A more recent and better documented parallel comes from Iberian waters, where orcas have been striking sailing vessels, particularly rudders, since 2020. By 2024, researchers had logged hundreds of these interactions, with a small number of boats sunk. The behavior has been traced to a handful of individual orcas and has since spread through the wider population, including to animals with no direct history of the original encounters. More than 30 scientists signed an open letter urging caution, stating clearly that orcas are socially complex, that different populations carry distinct cultural behaviors, and that this specific behavior appears to be spreading socially, while explicitly warning against assuming human-like motive behind it. None of this should be mistaken for settled science, and the researchers closest to this work are the first to say so. Structure alone does not equal meaning. Birdsong is highly structured. So is a modem handshake. No study has yet paired a specific coda with a specific, verifiable meaning under fully controlled conditions, and vowel-like resonance can, in principle, emerge from any air-filled cavity shaped a certain way, without implying intentional use. Audience design findings face the same challenge. Whales behave differently in different social contexts for many possible reasons, and separating genuine listener adjustment from simple situational variation remains difficult with current data. There is also a structural risk built into the method itself. Machine learning systems are built to find patterns, and given enough data, they generally will, whether or not that pattern carries real content. Researchers in this field are working to design tests that could actually confirm meaning. A specific coda, produced in a specific context, followed by a predictable and repeatable response in other whales, then validated by playing that same coda back and observing the same response in whales that were not part of the original study. That standard has not yet been met. Still, one coda keeps surfacing across the data in a way that has caught researchers' attention. Written by pattern as 1 + 1 + 3, it appears before dives, during surfacing, when separated groups reunite, and around births, situations with almost nothing in common except the presence of another whale nearby. The cautious hypothesis is that it functions something close to a simple statement of presence, an announcement that one animal exists and is near another. If that reading holds, it would mean the first message we may have understood from this species, after nearly 2 centuries of industrial hunting and 60 years of treating their sounds as noise, is also one of the most basic messages any social animal needs to send. Sperm whale calves are known to babble, producing rough, incomplete versions of their clan's identity coda for weeks before getting it right, memorizing it while their mother may be 1,000 meters below and out of acoustic range. That coda marks clan membership and stays with the animal for the rest of its roughly 70-year life. Whatever else remains uncertain about this research, that detail is hard to dismiss. The first thing a sperm whale calf is taught is not how to hunt or where to find food. It is who it belongs to. There is also a quieter, more urgent thread running underneath all of this. The ocean these animals depend on for communication has grown steadily louder over the past century, filled with shipping noise, sonar testing, and seismic surveying, all of it competing for the same acoustic space that sperm whales and humpbacks rely on to find each other, coordinate, and pass information across distances of miles. Marine acousticians have put the stakes bluntly. Hearing damage in an environment where sound replaces sight almost entirely does not simply inconvenience an animal, it isolates it. A whale that cannot hear its family is functionally alone in an ocean that offers no other way to stay connected. Commercial whaling killed several 100,000 sperm whales during the 20th century alone, and vessel strikes continue to kill them today. If even a fraction of what Project CETI and researchers like Beguš have proposed turns out to be accurate, each of those losses did not simply remove an animal from a population count. It potentially cut short an ongoing exchange of information passed between individuals who had spent decades building context with one another. That is part of why, in 2024, Maori leaders in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and indigenous leaders from the Cook Islands signed a treaty formally recognizing whales as legal persons, a symbolic but pointed legal step that reflects how seriously this research is now being taken outside the laboratory. Beguš has framed the underlying question about as directly as it can be framed. If human-like structures genuinely exist in how these animals communicate, then what exactly does that mean for how we define language, and what does it mean for how the law treats the species that use it? What Grok and systems like it have really done is not discover a whale language. They have made an existing, hard-won body of research legible to people who would never have opened the original papers, and in doing so, they have forced a public reckoning with questions marine biologists have been circling carefully for years. Whether any of this eventually meets the strict scientific bar for language may take another decade of controlled study to resolve. But the certainty that carried the last 60 years, the idea that these sounds were simply noise, does not survive contact with what 9,000 recordings, one hallway conversation, and a handful of very patient scientists have already shown. Somewhere beneath the surface, something has been organizing sound into structure for millions of years, adjusting how it speaks depending on who is listening, and quietly outlasting almost everything we assumed we understood about where language begins and ends.